Why were marital relations between white women and black men prohibited during slavery? One of the characteristics of any slave system was the possession of one person over another who was considered inferior. In that case, we are talking about white people who owned black slaves, reasons why whites were considered superior to blacks, and perhaps one could conclude that this was one of the reasons, but not the main one, why the relationships were prohibited. Marital relations between black men and white women during slavery were much less talked about than this type of relationship, which was considered immoral and shameful in a Puritan society of the 17th and 18th centuries in the British colonies of America, where the church had great influence, especially in the southern colonies of Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. But when two racially different human groups spend a lot of time together sharing the same territorial space, racial miscegenation is the result that is only achieved when both groups have intimate relations, whether forced, desired, or, in the most extreme cases, a product of rape. When we talk about enslaved people as both black men and women were, something you should keep in mind is that during the slave system in the United States, a black enslaved person who, due to their low social level, was considered less than a human being could be sold and bought as merchandise, but also physically exploited and emotionally abused and, above all, in many cases, used by her owners. Historically, we all know that black women were used and raped by white slave owners. When we talk about white women owning black slaves, this behavior never occurred or was simply hidden or denied. But we must ask ourselves the following questions. Were there intimate relations between white women and black slaves during slavery? If your answer is yes, why do we never hear stories of white women who were attracted to black slaves? Why were relations between black men and white women prohibited during slavery? In this video, we will try to answer those questions. When you look at the growth of the population of mulattoes or people of color during slavery, that tells you that in slave society, the body of the black woman, a product of the obsession with highlighting the intimate attributes of a person above any other quality, which is the result of the racial stereotypes associated with the intimate part of slave women, which in many cases was the product of a morbid mind in the imagination of many young white men who wanted to discharge their animal impulses more strongly through erotic images. Type of daring images where the black woman was the center of attention in those fantasies that every man has associated with the figure of the black woman's body. Thus, these types of burning fantasies associated with black slaves on the part of white men also existed in the minds of white women when they looked at the naked bodies of enslaved black men. How correct is the story when we talk about white women cheating on their white husbands with black men during slavery? Once again, that type of story could be considered speculation. You are watching this video, what do you think the answers should be? Let me know in your comments. Why were intimate relationships between black men and white women prohibited during slavery? The answer is yes, both in the past and in the present. We are used to hearing love stories between white men and black women during slavery, although there was a certain social taboo on this type of relationship considered socially incorrect and morally condemned by the church. Type of love story between a white man and a black woman where romance or love between them was never part of the relationship between a slave and his owner. A type of imposed relationship that we cannot consider as a love story. We must see it as a romantic tragedy because in most cases the black woman was not the owner of her body, which was presumed to be the property of her owner. Remember that during slavery, slaves and free people had no rights, and any marriage relationship that was not legally or socially established was considered immoral. As a result of the social prohibition associated with interracial relationships, in which couples are often not married, in the case where some wives of slave owners lived together and often lived with a certain shame, she had to accept that the mulatto children were seen as the product of an impure and immoral relationship before the laws of God between her husband and a black woman who was the property of her husband. Type of marital relationship between a black man and a white woman or vice versa, which was sometimes denied by participants due to the negative stereotypes associated with this type of relationship, which was condemned socially and, in some states, legally. As a result of racial mixing in some southern states, both a black man and a white woman could go to prison for violating these laws. So there were many interracial couples who lived their lives as a couple in secret. Were all marriages between a white man and a black woman a tragedy? My answer is no. In some of these relationships, although we talk about rape and exploitation of the bodies of black women by their white master, the words love, respect, and commitment were in many cases the reason behind this interracial union between a white woman and a black man in an equal economic and social condition. Perhaps that is why we should consider that just as there were consensual, intimate relationships between white men and black women, in the same way there were interracial relationships between black men and white women during slavery. Was it possible during slavery to have a romantic story between a white man and a woman? My answer is yes, as it was also possible, although to a lesser extent, to have a marital relationship between a black man and a white woman during that same period, where love was the basis of that relationship between people of different racial groups. And even more so when we talk about a free black man before and after the Civil War who had relationships with white women of the same level. It's not the kind of relationship we're talking about now. Try to answer the following question. Do you really believe that there was never an intimate relationship or hormone exchange between a white woman and a black man during slavery? Do you really believe that some white women never cheated on their white husbands with black slaves? We must be too naive to accept as true that kind of narrative about something we all know happened, especially when we all know that white men were intimate with black women. A type of behavior considered immoral by the society of the time, which was also imitated by white women, although we have never read written history about this type of prohibited relationship. Although everyone knew what happened in the rooms of white women when they were alone with a black man who was her property. And more so when the morality of the white woman is never questioned regarding this type of behavior that compromised that woman. This tells you that a love story between a white woman and a black man was something unimaginable and much less told. When one observes the levels of racial mixing between whites and blacks during that time, it is a reality that cannot be hidden when one observes the increase in the mulatto population in a large majority of the southern British colonies in American territory. Perhaps that is why we should not question the veracity of a romantic relationship between a white woman and a black man. In a society where purity, beauty, and morality that cannot be questioned have never occurred when we talk about white women. But it's the kind of story there is legal records on divorce, but also the writings left by white women who had intimate relationships, in some cases consensual, with free black men without caring about the protests of the husband about his wife's cheating with another man. As a result of the prohibitions and social challenges of this type of relationship during and after slavery, telling a love story between a white woman and a black man was never heard, even when this white woman was deeply in love with a black man. After the Civil War, were interracial marriages between blacks and whites legally permitted? The answer is no. We had to wait 2 centuries later in the federal case of Love versus Virginia, 388 U.S. 1967, as a unanimous court struck down state laws prohibiting marriage between people of different races, holding that these anti-miscegenation statutes violated both the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. Many historians recognize the relationship between a white man and a black woman, but never the relationship between a black man and a white woman, as some say, even though men show a certain bias when writing about this matter. Let's not fool ourselves, and you who are listening to this video must accept that is and was the harsh truth when we spoke about the marital relations between a white woman and a black man during slavery. My question is, why? This type of work attempts to provide the answer. When you analyze the social position of white women during slavery, you can understand the reasons behind the avoidance of discussing the history of a relationship between a white woman and a black man, the misrepresentation associated with racial miscegenation during slavery, and above all, the suppression of facts, false beliefs, and propaganda used by some white historians to perpetuate the racial superiority but also to protect the moral conduct of white women, creating the idea white women were considered morally pure. But historically, we all know that in the same way that slave owners exploited the bodies of black women, having forbidden relationships, white high society women also used the bodies of black men during and after slavery to satisfy their most intimate needs as women, a type of practice considered a sin and a socially immoral type of behavior that was known in all the colonies by those who enjoyed gossip. We have always heard that white women act as social ladies, guided by Christian values, conservative in their way of dressing, speaking, and behaving, and, above all, dedicated to their families, unlike black women who were considered immoral or promiscuous. Women who engaged in behavior that encouraged prohibited relationships between blacks and whites with any man, married or single, and they gave birth to black and mulatto children without knowing the father's name. But for this work, we will not talk about a tragic story about the marital relationship between blacks and whites, a marital relationship freely consensual or imposed during slavery. Perhaps that is why I will focus on talking about a personal story based on my life as a woman. A white woman who was living with a colored man during slavery. A black man whom she loved with all her heart, without caring what society thought of her, without thinking about my personal reputation, but also about the possibility that she could lose everything by having an interracial relationship which was prohibited. During the slavery in the United States, there never existed any type of marital relationship or concubinage between a black man and a white woman. It is an answer that many want to hide, especially when supremacist ideas dominated the cultural environment of the time among the white population, who said that white women were fragile, submissive, repressed, obedient to their white husbands, and, above all, believers in the Christian faith. A type of belief that prohibited interracial marital relations. Much less any type of activity considered prohibited between a white woman and a black man that was also considered an immoral act against the good customs of a Puritan slave society of the time was considered a sin by many believers. Do you really think a white woman never kind of fantasy associated with black men's bodies during slavery? It is time to break this social taboo that historically protected the image of white women during slavery to the detriment of the image of black women. During slavery, the exploitation of black women's bodies by a white man for pleasure or breeding slave children in the plantation was a known fact that was prohibited but never punishing legally. Reasons why the image of the black woman was never protected by society and much less by the church, which considered her an impure woman from the moment of her birth, inheriting all the sins of her non-Christian parents. It is the type of social taboo on interracial relationships before and after the Civil War that we will try to recognize in telling the history of these relationships, which were prohibited during slavery in the United States, by simply accepting that they occurred, although some Puritan-minded white conservatives claim otherwise. A story in which a white woman was deeply in love with a black man. A white woman who dared to challenge that anti-black idea imposed by supremacist ideas that the union between blacks and whites was prohibited not only by the laws of men but also by the laws of God, is a kind of story of courage that is worthy of admiration. The dramatic story of a white woman who risked her life, her sense of morality, and her religious beliefs to be with the man she loved deeply, regardless of social rejection but also that of her family. But when we talk about interracial relationships between blacks and whites during and after slavery, these types of love stories are forgotten in the past because they were realities of history that some do not want to hear. Still, right now, there are many people who are against racial mixing between people of different races, especially between a black man and a white woman, which is sad that some people are having those kinds of thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like this type of work, please subscribe to this channel, leave your comments, and like and share this type of video as a way to help this channel so that its content reaches a greater number of people.